Close reading is about attending carefully to what the author has given us. We explore the author's vision, ideas, and story. Close reading is about respecting the text. The meaning isn't just on the page. Meaning occurs when we think about the text. And so comprehension is then our interaction with the text and what occurs between the text and our mind. And so we start to explore metacognition. This video lesson is about closely reading to comprehend. And the standard is about simply comprehending literature and texts. Now, metacognition is our awareness and our understanding of our own thought processes. And so, we have a little song to connect to what we're thinking. Now, it's time to listen closely to that voice in our head when we read. We listen to that voice to record tracks of our thinking. These are some thinking stems that you can use to guide your reading tracks. They help me. I pay attention to the voice in my head. Here's an example of tracks I make when I'm reading. If I'm able to write directly in the book, that's what I do. And if not, I use flags to mark my thinking and post-it notes for those tracks. Reading for deeper comprehension often means reading something more than one time. Let me show you my close reading of this short article, All Jazzed Up in West Africa. It comes from the National Geographic Traveler. First, I read the article to consider the author's purpose and the topic overall. And so I thought that the author's purpose of the article was to inform. The map feature in the article helped me better understand where this place was located because I was a little confused by the reference. But overall, the topic of this article was about St. Louis in Senegal, Africa. Now, when I reread, I annotated, or I left some tracks of my thinking behind. Whenever possible, I like to mark directly on a text. If not, I'll use flags and post-it notes. But in this case, I copied it so that I could mark directly on the text. Now, while I can leave tracks in any way I like or annotate in any way I like, this is a system that we all can use, and it's a pretty simple one. We can highlight a main idea, star details, use a question mark if we have a question, and circle unfamiliar words. I determined that the main idea here was about the city re-emerging. Notice how it wasn't found in the first part of the article. Sometimes when we go to identify our main idea, we always assume that it's captured in a title or in the first couple sentences, and that's not always the case. When we closely read, we think about what this piece is mostly about. Then I went through and I starred those details that focused on how St. Louis, Senegal was re-emerging. This was such a short article. Reading it a third time wasn't a problem. Sometimes you'll need to read sections of text more than one time for deeper understanding. In this case, in my third reading, I was able to reflect upon patterns or connections. I found a pattern in a lot of renewal type words, such as reemerge, restoration, resurrection, and words that suggested change, like transformation or was once. I was able to make a meaningful connection. In other words, a connection that helped me better understand what I had read. I had read this article just a few short weeks after traveling to New Orleans, Louisiana. And words in the article actually described both places. I knew this from personal experience. When I was in NOLA, which is what the locals call Louisiana, I saw riverboats, wrought iron balconies, the Creole culture, jazz fest or festival references. It was very flamboyant. Saw the historic quarter, cafes, and even row houses. These are all things that were described in this place in Africa, but I knew from personal experience that it was, in fact, like New Orleans. And so this last sentence in the article, where the city is compared to New Orleans, made sense to me because of that personal connection I could make. Consider responding. For third graders, I always focused on the idea of an ACE response, answer, cite, and explain. But I want to kick it up a notch for fourth grade. When we respond, we're going to race. We want to restate the question or even the prompt that's guiding our response. Then we'll go on to answer the question completely, cite the evidence, and explain. I'm using an example from reading homework response choices to illustrate race. I chose to read a text on a topic of interest and cite an interesting piece of information that I had found. I evaluated how the author provided details to support this information, and I was able to make a meaningful connection. So, to restate the prompt, I'm saying exactly what it is I'm going to write about. I read an article called All Jazzed Up in West Africa, and I noticed an interesting piece of information. I'm connecting it back to what the prompt said. The author provided some great details to support the statement, and I made a connection. When you're restating, you are actually using language from your question or your prompt. Moving on to answering, citing, and explaining. Since it wasn't necessarily a question, I really wasn't answering per se, but I was giving that thinking information. So I said that the article was about the reemergence of St. Louis, Senegal, and a comparison was made to the city of New Orleans. That's what my response is about. I found evidence in the article. In this case, I didn't have complete sentences, but rather words and phrases. And then I explained how this evidence supported what I was saying. New Orleans, Louisiana has all of these things too because I visited and I either got to see these things or I learned about them from reading more about New Orleans while I was there. As a reference tool, I'd like you to include the definitions of all of these response terms in your notebook. That way, if you have any misunderstandings, you can always go back and check. We'll be referring to evidence quite frequently in here to make sure that we're providing information that supports our claims. Here are some other response terms that you're going to want to include in your notebook. Again, so that you can go back and check. Analyzing is huge in our classroom, so you'll be doing a lot of that this year. These terms are a domain-specific word vocabulary or jargon for literary response.